Hey everyone, and welcome! I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us for today's explainer. We're about to embark on a journey through something that's literally one of the most fascinating, majestic, and honestly, kind of intense texts of the ancient world. We're exploring the longest sustained theological argument in the entire New Testament, the book of Hebrews. If you've ever felt totally overwhelmed by all that complex imagery of high priests, ancient tabernacles, and old covenants, well, you are in the exact right place. We're going to unpack this brilliant masterpiece step by step and see exactly how its soaring theology was specifically designed to be an absolute anchor for a community in crisis.
So think about this for a second. When the pressure is really on, when you're facing intense opposition, and life just gets unbearably hard, why not just give up? Why not go back to what feels familiar and safe? This isn't just some modern philosophical question. This was the exact terrifying crisis facing the original first-century Jewish Christian audience of Hebrews. These folks were exhausted. They were facing intense persecution, and the temptation to just abandon their new confession for the safety of their old established religious structures, it was incredibly strong.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We're building this explainer on a really rigorous textual foundation today. The book of Hebrews is actually totally unique. It doesn't start like a typical letter with a standard greeting, but it actually ends like one. Scholars basically identify this text fundamentally as a masterful word of exhortation. It's actually a sermon. It's brilliant theology acting as faith-seeking understanding, delivered by a pastor who just desperately cares about his flock and is trying to save them from, essentially, a catastrophic spiritual shipwreck. So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the threat of drifting. Second, God's final word. Third, shadows and reality. And finally, the call to endure.
Section 1. The threat of drifting. A community in crisis.
To really grasp the theology here, we first have to understand the historical problem. We're looking at a marginalized community standing right on the precipice of giving up. They've already endured public exposure to abuse, they've had their property plundered. And that brings us to this incredibly severe concept, apostasy. The author of Hebrews isn't just worried about his congregation having a bad week, He is terrified about them decisively rejecting the grace of God's new covenant. He uses this vivid metaphor of a ship slipping its moorings, just slowly drifting away from the Christian confession under the crushing weight of pressure. It's that spiritual danger of slipping back into former, obsolete patterns of Judaism simply because, well, they seemed easier and less costly. Because the stakes are so unbelievably high here, the author strategically deploys 5 really severe warning passages scattered throughout his sermon. And notice the progression. He starts off by saying we absolutely must heed the revelation of the Son. Then, listen to God's voice while it is still today. But then, the tone gets much sharper. He warns about the impossibility of renewal if they fall away, the terrifying reality of God's judgment, and finally, a massive plea not to miss God's final word. These aren't just thrown in to scare the readers, they serve a super urgent pastoral purpose. They're meant to keep the audience on track and basically jolt them awake from their spiritual drift.
Section 2. God's final word, the ultimate solution. So if the problem is this perilous drifting, what exactly is the anchor? The author doesn't just offer some cheap psychological comfort here. He offers a breathtaking theological solution. The centerpiece of his entire argument is the definitive, ultimate revelation of God. Just look at how the book opens. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Boom! Right out of the gate, there's absolutely no throat clearing. This opening line immediately establishes the absolute supremacy of Christ. All of God's past speech, which, don't get me wrong, was completely true and good, is now telescoped into and perfectly refracted through the Son. Now, what's really interesting here is how systematically the author breaks all of this down. If you want to prove the new covenant is better, you have to prove the mediator is better, right? So he takes the absolute greatest figures of the Old Testament and lines them right up next to Jesus. Angels? Well, the Son is greater in both his eternal deity and his perfect humanity. Moses was a wonderful servant in God's house, for sure. But Jesus is the Son who actually built the house. And Joshua? Joshua brought the Israelites into the physical land of Canaan. But Jesus brings his people into the eternal, ultimate rest of God. Jesus literally surpasses them all. Section 3. Shadows and reality. Mechanics of the covenant.
So now that we know who Jesus is, we really need to understand what he did. This is where we get into the deepest, most famous theology of the book, focusing on the actual mechanics of this better covenant and Christ's superior high priesthood. To explain this, the author introduces a pretty complex, ancient concept, the order of Melchizedek. Let's demystify this a bit. In the Old Testament, priests had to come from the tribe of Levi. It was strictly based on ancestry. But the problem was, they kept dying, and their sacrifices never permanently removed sin. The author argues that Jesus holds a totally different, vastly superior priesthood. It is an eternal priesthood. It's not based on genealogy, but on an indestructible life. Jesus fulfills the priestly office with a permanent and ultimate authority that the old Levitical priests could literally never achieve.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core contrast of the entire book. On one side, we have the Old Covenant, the shadow. It had the Aaronic priesthood, a physical earthly tabernacle, and animal sacrifices that had to be repeated day after day, year after year. It was exhausting. But on the other side, we have the New Covenant, the absolute reality. Jesus holds the Melchizedekian priesthood. He enters not into some earthly tent, but the heavenly sanctuary itself. And he offers a once-for-all sacrifice, himself. The shadow was merely a pattern, but Christ is the breathtaking reality.
To help us really grasp this, I absolutely love this analogy from commentator Richard D. Phillips. He references C.S. Lewis's famous story, The Chronicles of Narnia. Think about the wardrobe in that story for a second. From the outside, it looks perfectly normal, mundane even. But creeping inside, you discover an entire, expansive, magical world hidden from view. The earthly tabernacle in the Old Testament was exactly like that. It was just a normal-looking tent on the outside, but it contained a heavenly mystery. It was just a beautiful illustration pointing toward the magnificent, true heavenly realities that Christ has now fully opened up for us.
This actually brings us to the absolute climax of the theology in Hebrews. As New Testament scholar Douglas J. Moo beautifully summarizes here, Jesus, our high priest, has actually opened the way to the presence of God himself. And this profound theological reality is exactly what buttresses, what strictly supports the author's passionate call for us to boldly enter that presence. See, the theology isn't just meant to sit in our heads as a bunch of facts. It is the bridge to our required, living response.
Section 4, the call to endure, living the theology. So, the author brings all of this dense, glorious theology right back down to earth. Because if Jesus is this great and his sacrifice is this perfect, how on earth is this battered, exhausted community supposed to wake up and live tomorrow morning? The answer is faith. Hebrews uniquely defines faith in chapter 11 not just as a casual intellectual belief, but as the reality of things hoped for and evidence of things not seen. In Hebrews, faith is deeply, inextricably linked to endurance. It is a forward-looking certainty. Faith is what allows believers to see completely beyond their immediate suffering, beyond their marginalization, and securely anchor their souls in the unchanging, unseen reality of God's promises.
So, the crucial point is this. What we truly believe about Jesus basically dictates our eternal destiny. As the renowned scholar F. Bruce notes regarding this text, the truth of the gospel in Hebrews simply cannot be held lightly. It must be cherished, it has to be held tightly at all costs. Drifting away from it just because the culture is pressing in on you isn't just some minor mistake or a slight misstep. It is a matter of absolute spiritual life and death.
Which leaves us with a deeply personal conclusion for today's explainer. The book of Hebrews wasn't just speaking to some first-century audience. It's speaking across the centuries directly to us right now. Think about this final question. Today, which by the way, Hebrews reminds us is literally the only time we are guaranteed. If you hear his voice in the midst of your own storms, your own pressures, your own doubts, will you let yourself drift away? Or will you boldly anchor yourself in this supreme, finished reality of the Son? The way has been opened, the choice is yours. Thank you so much for exploring this incredible text with me, and keep learning.